The story of North Korea is one of isolation, ideology, and inherited power. Beginning in the aftermath of World War II, when Korea, once a unified peninsula under Japanese colonial rule, was divided along the 38th parallel, with the Soviet Union occupying the north and the United States occupying the south, setting the stage for the emergence of two ideologically opposed states. And in 1948, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, commonly known as North Korea, was officially established under the leadership of Kim Il-sung, a former anti-Japanese guerrilla fighter and staunch communist who would go on to rule the country with an iron grip, establishing a cult of personality that portrayed him as an almost divine figure, and introducing the Juche ideology, a doctrine of self-reliance that emphasized independence from foreign influence in politics, economics, and defense, though in practice it led to extreme isolation, centralized control, and growing dependence on China and the Soviet Union. In 1950, emboldened by support from Stalin and later Mao Zedong, Kim Il-sung launched an invasion of South Korea in an attempt to reunify the peninsula by force, sparking the Korean War, a brutal and devastating conflict that lasted 3 years and resulted in millions of deaths, massive destruction, and eventually a stalemate, with the armistice signed in 1953 that restored the border near the 38th parallel, but left the two Koreas technically still at war. And after the war, North Korea focused on rebuilding its economy through Soviet-style central planning, achieving modest industrial growth in the 1960s. Yet it soon fell behind its southern neighbor, as South Korea embraced market reforms and international trade, while North Korea remained stuck in an increasingly rigid and militarized system that prioritized defense and loyalty to the supreme leader over innovation or openness. And as decades passed, Kim Il-sung further entrenched his power, creating a one-party state dominated by the Korean Workers' Party, purging rivals, expanding the secret police, and tightly controlling information and expression, while constructing a massive propaganda machine that taught children from birth to worship him and to view the outside world as dangerous and hostile. And when he died in 1994, after nearly 5 decades in power, he passed leadership to his son, Kim Jong-il, marking the first hereditary succession in a communist state, which further solidified the dynastic nature of the regime. And under Kim Jong-il, North Korea entered a period of profound crisis, including the Great Famine of the 1990s known as the Arduous March, during which hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, died of starvation, a tragedy compounded by economic mismanagement, natural disasters, and the collapse of Soviet support, all while the government prioritized military spending over food production. And in 2006, North Korea shocked the world by conducting its first nuclear test, confirming long-standing fears that it had developed weapons of mass destruction. And over the next several years, it continued testing nuclear devices and ballistic missiles, despite international sanctions, diplomatic condemnation, and growing isolation, while Kim Jong-il maintained power through loyalty networks, repression, and the continued use of propaganda that painted North Korea as a besieged fortress surrounded by enemies. And in 2011, after his death, power passed to his young and relatively unknown son, Kim Jong-un, who quickly moved to consolidate his rule, eliminating potential rivals including his own uncle, Jang Song-thaek, who was executed for alleged treason, and later his half-brother, Kim Jong-nam, who was assassinated with nerve agent in Malaysia in 2017. Actions that signaled the new leader's ruthlessness and determination to retain control. And while Kim Jong-un introduced limited economic reforms, such as allowing small markets and some degree of entrepreneurship, the core structure of the regime remained authoritarian and repressive. And he accelerated North Korea's nuclear program, overseeing multiple missile launches and conducting the country's most powerful nuclear test to date in 2017, which led to heightened tensions with the United States and a war of words with then-President Donald Trump. Though surprisingly, in 2018 and 2019, Kim participated in historic summits with South Korea and the U.S., including a meeting in Singapore with Trump that marked the first ever between a sitting American president and a North Korean leader, raising hopes for peace and denuclearization, but ultimately these talks broke down due to disagreements over sanctions relief and the future of North Korea's nuclear arsenal. And since then, diplomacy has stalled while sanctions remain in place, and North Korea has continued to develop its weapons capabilities, all while facing growing economic challenges exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, which led the country to seal its borders completely, cutting off even limited trade with China, its primary ally and economic partner. And while the world watches with uncertainty, the regime continues to survive through a combination of internal repression, external defiance, and a tightly controlled narrative that portrays the Kim family as the eternal guardians of the Korean people. And despite international condemnation of its human rights abuses, nuclear brinkmanship, and provocations, North Korea remains defiant, often using threats and military demonstrations to gain leverage in global diplomacy. And the regime justifies its actions by citing decades of perceived hostility from the United States and its allies, pointing to military exercises, sanctions, and the Korean War as evidence that it must maintain a strong deterrent, especially nuclear weapons, to ensure its survival and within the country. Citizens are subjected to strict surveillance, ideological indoctrination, limited access to foreign media, and harsh punishment for dissent. While the government stages massive parades and spectacles to showcase its military power and celebrate the ruling family, it's creating an environment where fear and loyalty are constantly reinforced. And as of now, Kim Jong-un remains firmly in control, though speculation continues about his health, potential successors, and the long-term viability of the regime, especially as economic hardships intensify. And although some analysts argue that gradual reform could open the door to change, others caution that the regime's priority has always been survival, not reform, and it will do whatever is necessary to retain power, even at the expense of its people's well-being. And so, the story of North Korea is still unfolding, shaped by a legacy of war, ideological extremism, hereditary dictatorship, and a relentless pursuit of nuclear power, while the rest of the world watches, waits, and wonders whether peace, collapse, or confrontation will ultimately define the next chapter of this isolated and enigmatic nation.